Hello and welcome to lecture number 9. Today we're going to talk about daily life in the Middle Ages. The rough time period would be about 1000 to 1500 AD. In many ways, the approach for today is pretty straightforward. We'll look at typical conditions faced by a range of people living in the Middle Ages. But we'll also look at a major population drop. We're going to look at the Black Death, or the so-called plague, that led to a tremendous loss of life in Europe. Before we can do that, though, I do want to take a first step, and I want to address some characteristics of feudalism. Feudalism was the social and economic system common throughout different parts of Europe during the era of the Middle Ages. The first concept to address is the fact that there was an absence of central authority, and individuals, often referred to as warlords, often dominated. For centuries, the Roman Empire had provided authority throughout the Mediterranean. This was often seen with symbols like the Arch of Titus shown here on the right. With this authority, there was civilization and protection for individuals. However, with the fall of Rome in 476, this lack of authority eventually evolved into chaos. Bandits and warlords plagued the countryside, and individuals sought protection from those who had power. Eventually, unique relationships developed between landowners and the commoners. The key to power in this era was ownership of land. What we will see is that due to this feudalistic system, unique relationships developed, and they influenced how people interacted with one another, particularly in rural areas. Next, we'll focus on the nobility. Just to get us started, I'd like to look at the medieval hierarchy, and then we'll focus on the nobles. This image on the right identifies the three primary classifications of people in this era. On the left, we see a monk. He was a member of the clergy, and he is responsible for prayer and people's spirituality. The knight is shown here in the middle. He was a member of the noble class and provided protection for people. On the right, we see a peasant. His responsibility was to produce food and other supplies. In many ways, this makeup of society can be explained by showing this triangle. There were a handful of people at the top. These were members of the nobility, probably making up to 5% of the population. The clergy was next to the top. Maybe this included 5 to 10% of the population. And then we have the masses, or peasants. These were people who worked the land, who made up about 85 to 90% of the population. Now there were two types of nobles. The first would be the lords. Generally speaking, they were very wealthy, and they were the ones who owned the land. If you've heard of the phrase that someone was the lord of the manor, well, the manors were large stretches of land owned by individuals. This painting identifies a few members of the nobility. On the right, we see a judge, and then we see a gentleman and a lady. It's possible that they're signing a marriage contract here. The second type of a noble would be a vassal or a knight. These were the warriors. They provided protection for people. The relationship between the vassal and lord was a very personal one. On the day one was to become a knight, one took a bath of purification. It was also linked to Christian rituals which were important at the time. Often the ceremony would take place in a chapel. At the height of the ceremony, the lord dubbed the individual to be their knight, and the knight pledged his support or subservience to him by placing his hands within the hands of the lord and swearing an oath of fidelity. Often, this was associated with taking communion as well. Now you may be wondering, why would a vassal or a knight pledge to do this? Well, each knight would receive a fief. This was a stretch of land, and the serfs to work the land. One thing to keep in mind, however, is that literacy rates remained very low. So even if a person was a member of the nobility, that doesn't necessarily mean that they could read and write. By the 11 and 1200s, to show the distinctiveness of a family, many of these nobles adopted a family name, or a last name, maybe even a crest. Notice the Nagel family crest here on the right. I found this on the internet. In later years, it wasn't simply members of the nobility that adopted last names. Let me show you an example. My mom's maiden name was Metzger. Well, in German, Metzgerei would be a sausage-maker. When I traveled to Germany, I saw a shop where you could purchase sausage, and it was called a Metzgerei. And so, those images are shown here. The Middle Ages was the era of castle building. These were the homes where many nobles lived. On the right, you see the image of the Burg Linn castle located in Germany, and on the left, you see how the castle evolved over a period of about 300 years. The castles were designed to keep invaders out. They were experts with defense. Here we see the Drawbridge and Portcullis at Burg Linn Castle. Often the castles would have their own chapel inside, along with a minister. Here we see the interior of a castle. On the right, there's a huge room. These rooms had to be heated, and they didn't have central air and heat. So, on the left, you see the size of one of these huge fireplaces. Often, they would be at either end of a large room. Often, the castles were drafty and dreary. On the left, you see a tapestry. Because the walls of these castles were often very bare, the tapestries would be used as pieces of art in order to cover the walls. On the right, you see a bedroom. Notice the sparse decorations within that room. Food for members of the nobility was dominated by bread and meat. Sometimes the old bread could be made into a porridge by breaking it up into little pieces, putting it in a bowl, and then pouring some boiling water on top. As far as meat goes, fish, chicken, pork, and wild game would have been quite common. It was rare for them to have beef. They also would have access to dairy, and beer was consumed by all ages. The wealthy also could afford expensive imports from the Middle East, with important spices like sugar or maybe even wine from France. These images help to show the types of entertainment which were available for members of the nobility. In the upper left-hand corner, we see several dancers getting ready to perform following a feast. Members of the noble class also hunted. This was something not available for commoners. In the upper right-hand corner, we see a nobleman hawking. Hawks were often trained as pets. And in the bottom right-hand corner, we see bear baiting. This was something that was left over from the Roman era, kind of a blood sport, where dogs were trained to go after a bear like this that was chained up someplace in the middle of a town. Tournaments were also held. Often, they were organized around some sort of a special occasion, like a wedding or another celebration. Mounted on horses, knights in their full costumes would fight each other with blunted weapons. This helped to maintain their fighting skills, and it also provided a release of tension and entertainment, but they often turned bloody. Okay, so I know this is a bit cheesy, but when we were in South Carolina one year for spring break, we went to one of these tournaments. It was actually pretty cool to see the horses and the knights and sword fights and jousting matches and things like that. I'd like to switch gears now and talk about what daily life was like for peasants and serfs. Peasants and serfs made up the bulk of the population, maybe as much as 85 or 90%. These were the people who worked the land. They were tied to it, and often they would have access to about 30 or so acres of land that were provided by a lord or a knight. This map helps to show what a manor would have looked like back in the Middle Ages. The areas which are circled show the manor house, where the castle would have been, as well as the village, where different members of the peasant and serf class would have had their homes. The arrows are pointing to different fields. Often these were in strips that were long and narrow, and an individual would have these plots of land in different parts of the manor itself. In return for being allowed to work the land, peasants were required to perform the corvée. This was work that the peasants and serfs completed on the lord's land. A typical arrangement would be organized like this. A serf or a peasant would receive about 30 acres of land to work. In return, they completed the corvée, maybe about 2 or 3 days per week on average, where they would work the lord's land. If they were working for the lord on a particular day, they would receive 2 meals. In return for completing this work, peasants and serfs would receive a portion of the crops that they raised. Depending upon how much they worked each week on the lord's land, maybe 75 to 90% of the profits they were able to keep. They also received protection from outsiders. The diet for peasants and serfs was very monotonous. Black bread and beer were the staples. Again, just as the wealthy would have a porridge where they would take the old bread and pour hot water over it, that was very common for peasants and serfs as well. They could get protein from eggs and dairy, and possibly some fish, but generally speaking, they didn't get much meat. The only kind of meat that they would have would maybe be some salted pork. Famine was a serious threat. Generally speaking, they lived in one-room homes. The walls would either be wooden or made of stone. Usually the roofs were thatched with grasses. Generally speaking, everyone slept in one large bed. Animals often slept inside the home at night. This provided heat in the winter, and it also helped to make sure that they would be protected from bandits. Women had numerous duties throughout the household, but they were always subject to their husband's authority. In many cases, women would have a spinning wheel, as shown here in this painting, and they would spin wool in order to provide extra money for their families. Life expectancy was short, and infant mortality was high. Between 30 to 50% of all children died before they reached the age of 5. People married at a younger age as well. Boys could be married as young as at the age of 14, and girls by the age of 12. The practice of medicine was not as advanced as it is today. Bloodletting was quite common because they believed that if someone was sick, they must have some bad blood within their body. Often the activities of the peasant class were dictated by the seasons. We see the beginning of this in the upper left-hand corner, as it must be winter. Once the snows fell away, they had to clean up. As you continue on, you see in the spring, they would try to get the fields ready, have to shear sheep, and on you can see. One time period that was reserved for celebration would be the fall. After everyone harvested the grains, they would get ready for the winter by butchering pigs and salting the meat. On the right, we see a harvest festival. Usually on different manors, the lord of the manor would sponsor a great celebration where people could have all sorts of food and there would be music and dancing. A range of entertainments were available. The painting on the left is entitled Children's Games. It's by Bruegel. We see children playing with dolls and swings and blowing bubbles and playing leapfrog, walking on stilts, and all sorts of things. In the upper right, we see a tavern. These were locations where people could have alcohol, but also it's where people came together to gossip, to find out news, and just to have conversations with their friends. On the bottom right, we see a cockfight. These are illegal in the United States today, but they were quite common among the peasants and serfs in different parts of Europe in this era. I'd like to switch gears now, and instead of focusing on rural communities, I'd like to look at what life was like in towns and cities. Most people lived in rural areas, so we're only talking about 5% of the total population, but it is important to point out that some towns and cities were evolving. London was a large city in England, but it only had about 10,000 people in the 1200s. Paris was the largest city in Europe. It had over 200,000 in the 1300s. Florence and Milan were two large cities in Italy. Now, Just as a brief comparison, the city of Tenochtitlán was the capital of the Aztec Empire in what is today Mexico. In 1500, they had a population of 300,000. During the Middle Ages, the guild system evolved. Here we see the origins of modern industry and education. It established a training or education system whereby people were trained in a range of trades. One of the most important industries was the cloth industry. Here we see some guild workers dyeing the cloth a different color. On the left, we see a portrayal of glassmaking, and on the right, a butcher shop. The head of an individual guild shop would be the master. This was the shop owner, and you could become a master only if you had enough money and connections. Below the master would be the journeyman. They would earn wages, plus they would receive room and board. If someone was learning the trade, they would be an apprentice. They worked for room and board, but they did not earn a wage. Usually you would have to work 7 years, and you'd have to show that you had obtained your skills. Unskilled laborers were at the bottom of this system. Just as society is characterized by a triangle, so too were the guilds, with the master on the top and unskilled laborers at the bottom. Next, I'd like to explore some of the factors that led to a major drop in Europe's population in this era. Historians believe between 1300 and 1450, Europe lost about half, if not 2/3 of its population. More than one factor led to this. The first would be famine. Between 1000 and 1300, the population of Europe doubled. However, Europe also experienced a mini ice age, and food production did not increase, and so this led to famine. The second and the largest factor would be disease, or pestilence, beginning about 1350. The Black Death hit, and it killed thousands, tens and hundreds of thousands. It's believed that the Black Death had its origins in either the Middle East or Asia. As much as 1/3 of China's population died. It came to Europe in 1347, and it was first seen in Marseille. It then spread to different cities in Europe. It was probably carried by rats, or the insects or fleas on rats. The first symptoms included chills, a high fever, headache, and vomiting, and then there was swelling of the lymph nodes. Soon, the symptoms changed, and black or purple spots began to appear on people's arms or thighs. It's believed after it first hit in 1347, within 3 years, 1/4 to half of Europe's population died. It then hit again and again and again, and it came in many different forms. The bubonic plague was the most common. No doctor's advice or medicine could overcome or alleviate the disease. An enormous number of ignorant men and women set up as doctors, in addition to those who were trained. There was no treatment possible. People were ignorant because they just didn't know what caused it. On the left, we see someone in a plague-protecting suit who's acting as a physician. That beak that you see toward the top, it probably had a handkerchief in it that had been dipped in either perfume or vinegar in order to try to make sure that the smells of the rotting bodies didn't get to their nose. On the right, we see an illustration of the Grim Reaper. There was a breakdown in the traditional social order. Citizens avoided one another, neighbors did not talk with each other, sometimes relatives as well. On the left, we see the execution of several men who were accused of spreading the disease. On the right, we see others. These flagellants are trying to atone for humanity's sins by whipping themselves in hopes that God would intervene and save humankind. People believed that the end of the world was at hand. There was tremendous despair throughout society. On the left, we see people praying as others die in the streets. There were so many people who died There were many victims who were placed in mass graves. This painting from the era demonstrates that even members of the nobility could be hit with this disease. We see death assailing a young nobleman. Now I'd like to wrap things up with a few final thoughts. Well, this presentation has addressed daily life for people living in the Middle Ages. What you want to be able to do is write an essay that describes different aspects of people's daily lives. You should be able to compare and contrast life for the nobility versus commoners, life for people living in rural areas as well as in towns and cities. All of this within the backdrop of the Black Death. Well, this ends the presentation. I hope you learned something new, and I hope you have a great day. Take care.